Today's lecture, like I said, I'm going to talk about like between the wars, because a lot of conflict, especially in Europe, of course, leads to the road down to Second World War, World War II. We'll talk about especially the rise of fascism in Europe. It's also in Asia, which I'll probably get that later. Talk about that. From last time, I had talked about the end of World War One, how Germany was in ruins after the war. They pretty much had lost the war. And of course, the Treaty of Versailles had kind of pretty much redone most of Europe, because we talked about all these new countries that were kind of created by it, which kind of helped Hitler later, come to power and take over Europe, which we'll see, of course, later. So I'll kind of be getting into, talking about the rise of fascism between the wars, how, Hitler, Mussolini, and all these other fascists, kind of that rise to power between the wars, creates, World War II and all that. So I want to go ahead and talk about today a little bit what happened after the war. Of course, we have the so-called failure of really Germany after the war. It's one of the big things that happens that's well famous overall is, of course, the fact that the Weimar Republic was put in power after the war ended. Germany's first experiment with like a Republican type government democracy doesn't go well, of course, like they wanted. And kind of talk about, one of the first things about that. So at the end of the war, if you know about what happened, they had this thing called they call it the German Revolution broke out, 1918 to 1919, and it caused the collapse of the constitutional monarchy of the Germans. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had been the ruler, was forced to go into exile, which he went, I think, to the Netherlands at one point. And so they replaced the German government with a democracy that was more like a Republican type government that they put in power. And so later they give it a nickname. They call it the so-called Weimar Republic, which is what a lot of the Western powers call it. Kind of put it up here, a picture, of course, of the Weimar with, I'll get to Hindenburg, who was one of the rulers of it at one point. But from 1919 to 1933, you have Germany kind of ruled mostly by socialists. Like the Social Democratic Party was one of the main political parties that really controlled the country during that time. However, the official name that they actually call the state, if you want to know, they either call it the German Reich, is what the German people called it, or the other name they called it was the Dutch Republic, or German Republic, if you want the English variation of it. Most people in like Europe and I think in America call it just Germany, for short, and all that. And so that particular, they called it Weimar because the actual state and its constitution was created at Weimar, Germany. So it's the kind of the nickname that they used, of course, with it. But it was more of an experiment at first because, Germany really never had a Republican state much. And so what ended up happening, of course, was that this particular government was a liberal type government, which was actually had at one point, if you study about it, direct representation, like with voting, like universal suffrage. And so under it, both men and women could vote. I think even have female representatives in the German parliament and all that. And eventually has a bicameral parliament that they also create, which has most famously the Reichstag, which the Reichstag was actually the lower house of the German parliament, which is the only one that people could be directly elected to. That's why it was kind of important. It was in a building called the Reichstag building, which I'll kind of show you later. They also have the Reichsrat, which is like an upper house they had as well. And then the most important thing, about the whole Weimar, the Republican government, was they got rid of the monarch and they put in a president. So they have the president of Germany that's put in, which is more of a ceremonial position, which is an elected position. And then the chancellor, which is more like a prime minister, was appointed by the president of Germany. And whoever has the majority, I guess, political power that's, in the parliament would usually the head of that party would end up being the prime minister or chancellor. And so that's the kind of the model that the Germans still have today. In the modern German Republic we have now, the Federation. Now, they had different presidents of Germany. I'll kind of mention later. Those are like really the first two presidents that they had of the German Republic. They put in Friedrich Ebert, who you see on the left, had been previously a chancellor of the Germans under the Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the first president from 1919 to 1925. He died in office. He was a political member of the Social Democrat Party. And then on the right, you had, of course, Paul von Hindenburg. He, of course, was a former World War I general, one of the best generals really on the German side in the war. He was in office later as president from 1925 to 1934, also dying in office as well. I think he was in his 80s when he died. And Hindenburg later, as you know, is famous for appointing Hitler to, the chancellorship on Germany. And so some people think that was one of the causes of why, the Third Reich, of course, was created. And so we'll kind of get to that and talk about that, of course, later. Now, talk a little bit about what happened in Germany, some of the reasons why the state, of course, failed at one point. Well, if you look at Germany here, one of the things that, of course, happened after the war was that the Germans really struggled after the war. They had a post-war depression that happened in like Europe, and I think in the United States, they kind of had that problem as well. Also, the Germans had to pay off all their war reparations and also all the war debts that they had to pay back, whatever they paid on the war itself. And I think the total amount was like 72 billion, including the reparations and the war debts that they owed from loans or whatever. And so that was equivalent to like something like $1 trillion in American dollars today is how much money they owed after the war. And a lot of this caused a lot of what they call hyperinflation to hit the country, which is true, where money, became worthless in the country. And so it got to the point where they were even printing like these $1 million Deutschmarks, which you see right here as an example. And so the money was pretty much just not worth anything. It took a lot of money to buy something. Really, you had to go almost get a wheelbarrow to actually buy like bread, or even go to, if you want to buy beer in a pub or whatever, beer hall, it took like stacks of money pretty much. And so some people took the money and they did stuff with it, like made clothes out of it, wallpaper. You got kids stacking stuff up. There's a one at the top right, you can see they're taking the money, actually literally burning it, like in the furnace to keep cold, kids keep warm in the winter. Because wood would be more expensive to buy. So kind of like now with the inflation we're kind of going through in this country, you go to the store and there's like nothing not stuff in the store as much as it should be. And of course, inflation, can't buy anything either as much. So that's kind of a lot to do with why that happened. Later, it's going to get worse. The Great Depression will hit by the early 1930s, and that's going to allow radical groups, like Adolf Hitler, the Nazi Party, to eventually rise to power. So that's another thing that really leads into, why Hitler's able to come to power, because of, bad economic times and things like that. Now, I'm going to next get to, of course, and talk about also the rise of fascism that happens, of course, in Europe. Yeah, in Europe, they start to kind of turn to it was either fascism or communism. I think that was the kind of the two choices that people were kind of looking at overall. But in a lot of countries, fascism becomes kind of popular, like in Germany, Italy, somewhat in Spain as well, because democracy, capitalism just wasn't working like they wanted it to. And so let's first talk about, what exactly is fascism? How does it compare to, say, communism and things like that? Well, fascism, which you see right here, a lot of its components are totalitarian, which, of course, we'll get to later. I'll kind of give you a quote right here, but Mussolini, who is obviously the archetype to it, he said that it was a movement that was born out of the need of action, because I guess governments weren't doing their job and all that. Fascism was this kind of like this right-wing political ideology that's very favored more towards like extreme nationalism or ultra nationalism. There's a lot of emphasis on trying to rebuild the state, the military. It's very anti-communist, so they don't like communism, and of course employs a lot of like police type state, where they spying on the people. There's a lot of secret polices and things like that. And in the end, it's very totalitarian, ruled by dictators. It's opposed to things like they don't like anarchism, they don't like democracy, civil liberties are limited. They don't like liberalism. They don't like Marxism. Just kind of give you ideas about those kind of things. Mussolini said it best. He said that fascism was not the nursling of a doctrine previously drafted at a desk. It was born out of the need of action and was action. It was not a party at first, which it wasn't, believe it or not. It's more like a movement. It's actually an anti-party movement. It's kind of what it was. So we'll get to Mussolini. Mussolini is really the archetype that really, that creates it at first, I guess, in Europe and spreads to other countries and all that. It's capitalist still. That's one of the things about fascism. It's still capitalist. However, like a lot of these fascist countries, like in Germany, et cetera, there is a lot of state-controlled economics that kind of goes into it. They allow, like private property rights and things like that, having a market economy. They don't mess with people that are wealthy usually, things like that. So it's not like communism, how they try to take everybody's property and, you can't own a business and things like that. So definitely not, they're not anti-capitalist, that kind of thing. They kind of try to work with the capitalists and because they need them for, I guess, their movement and all that, which is part of why Hitler did that, later as examples. Like in Nazi Germany, they're very racist, of course, racist policies. Like the Germans really believed in the master race, that German blood, was superior to other people and things like that. Of course, the Germans were very anti-Semitic. They hated Jews and they hated communists and groups like that overall. And so that movement was a little racist. Italians were kind of somewhat racist and thought they were superior too. But I don't know about being as anti-Semitic compared to, say, the Nazis were overall. Now, of course, the most famous, early, fascist they always talk about is Benito Mussolini, who you see right there in that image. Mussolini later is the prime minister of the Kingdom of Italy. And you would take over, which I think he used it at first kind of somewhat democracy to kind of take power. And then over time, he then became a dictator. It's interesting about Mussolini. He was actually a veteran of World War I, kind of like Hitler was later. He was a school teacher at one point. He even was a journalist. And what's really weird was he had a paper, I think at one point, that he was an editor of, which was actually socialist. He started out as a socialist and then switched to being a fascist and all that. And he was kind of angry about how the country just wasn't doing well after the war. There was kind of a post-war depression. And he had all these different groups that were kind of fighting against each other, like, the socialists versus the fascists and things like that, the country, left versus right, that kind of thing. And so he starts this movement, the National Fascist Party, which was a party that formed after World War I that believed in trying to, continue Italian nationalism, to unify the state even more. He also wanted to make Italy into a major power. That's one of his dreams that they talked about, because he kind of saw maybe Italy as maybe being another Roman Empire, controlling the Mediterranean region and all that. So one of the things that Mussolini did that's well known was he adopted a new symbol of their movement, which was, of course, the fasci, which goes back to Roman times. The fasci is an ancient Roman symbol that the Romans used, I think, going back to the monarchy, the republic. And it's a symbol of like Roman power and authority. And the word fasci means in Latin bundle, because they took a bundle of rods and it was bound around together around an axe. And it symbolized, I guess, everybody's like one. And I guess with all the rods bound together, you can't break it apart very easily. So that was kind of incorporated, into like flags and symbols and things like that in their movement. And so it's kind of a way to give, Italians pride in themselves and then try to reestablish Italy as a major power, not just in Europe, but maybe in parts of Africa or things like that. And so that's his idea of Mussolini. Mussolini later on becomes more militarized. Later, he will start wearing like military uniforms. He was also known for being a great speaker, kind of like Adolf Hitler, giving long speeches to people. And one of the things he did to gain power was he formed his, I'll get to the March on Rome, but he forms his movement into like a bunch of like these paramilitary forces that are kind of famous, that are known as the Black Shirts. He used the so-called Black Shirts help fight, enemies of the state that were within, which were like socialists and communists, et cetera, that he kind of used them to kind of seize power in the country. It's like a paramilitary force, the Black Shirts, which a lot of them were composed of, a lot of them were veterans of World War I and all that. And actually, the name was actually called the Voluntary Militia for National Security. But over time, it was called the Black Shirts because of their blackish colored looking uniforms that they wore. They're kind of similar to the SA Brownshirts that Hitler develops, Nazi Germany. And at one point, it had like something like 300,000 people that were actually in it. And what's famous was in 1922, Italy was on the verge of like a civil war because you had one side, you got the Marxists, socialists trying to take over the country. Then you got those that, of course, are the fascists. And so Mussolini had this national demonstration where about, I think, 30,000 men, it was in October of 1922, did the so-called March on Rome. And they basically said that if the king of Italy didn't put Mussolini in as prime minister, you'd be looking at a civil war within the country. And so what happened was the king of Italy, to prevent civil war, he basically appointed Mussolini prime minister right afterwards. This is in October, October. And so basically that's how Mussolini is able to basically get in power overall. What happened was, you can see Mussolini in that picture there, by the way, wearing kind of a, just a suit or whatever. Within a few years after that, he kind of turns Italy into this totalitarian state, I think by the mid 1920s. And it becomes very militarized. And of course, he starts wearing, like I said, military uniforms, things like that. And then, of course, one of the things he starts to do, if you know about Mussolini, he even starts to adopt a title that became real famous, you've probably heard about, which is the Il Duce, as he starts calling himself, which Il Duce means in Italian either the Duke, or really, I think somebody say the leader, and he'll be like dictator of pretty much of Italy up to like the 1940s, at least up to 1943. But he's kind of like a fascist dictator, I know, in northern Italy later up to 1945 before his death. But he is kind of seen, like that's one thing about Mussolini, he's kind of like this model, prototype model for other fascists that influence like Adolf Hitler and maybe even Franco, in Spain and things like that that you have. So that's how Mussolini kind of gets into power, kind of almost like did it democratically in somewhat. And then when they seize power, that's when they basically create a totalitarian state. There's Mussolini with the March on Rome right there. Also, I think there's another image showing the fascists That's another thing. It's interesting too. You see the fascist like salute, which you see with the arm raised. That's a common salute, which I think the Italian one was more with the hand kind of not quite straight, and then the Nazi salute was more like a 45-degree angle with the arm straight out. So you kind of see the difference between the different salutes, which I think they say the salute idea kind of came back all the way to the Roman times, because Roman emperors would sometimes salute like that and stuff like that. Right, now I'm going to next talk about, of course, the rise of Adolf Hitler. That's, of course, a big thing that's of course, a very, big topic, that leads to, of course, World War II later that we have. As you know, Hitler rose to power, in Germany, mostly in the 1920s and 1930s. The one thing about Hitler, he was not originally from Germany. He was from Austria. He was Austrian-born native that was born there in 1889. I think his father was kind of like from the upper middle class. I think it was something to do with the diplomatic stuff I know he did in Austria. But the one thing that that made Hitler was really World War One. I think Hitler, if you study about his early life, he actually wanted to be an artist when he was in Austria. At one point, he tried to get into an art school in Vienna, of course, and when failed, he kind of became a bum in Vienna. And then, but World War I broke out, and the war kind of changed Hitler a lot. And so he got a lot of experience from that. He actually was a hero in the war somewhat, and even was given at one point 2 Iron Crosses for his bravery. And then after the war, Hitler joined this political party, which was originally called the German Workers' Party, which was kind of this right-wing working class party that was in Munich, Bavaria, in southern Germany. And by 1921, he had become its main leader, which, if you know about Adolf Hitler, part of why he became so popular was because of the fact that he was a great orator. He was a great speaker. And so people were kind of enthralled by him. Some people even said that Hitler was almost like a messiah to some of the Germans. They were so, obsessed with him and all that. I think the women would swoon, when they would see him and things like that. And then eventually, by 1921, Hitler took the name of the party and he changed it. You know about this. It became known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, which later other people called it just Nazi or the Nazis. And so the name stuck. Here's actually the German name, National Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiter Party. You see, that's where they get the NSDAP from, which is the actual initials for the actual party. The first part, which is National Socialism, is pretty much where they get the word Nazi from. It's like the short version of it. What exactly was the Nazi Party? Well, it was this pro-German nationalist party that was very anti-communist. They didn't like the communists, although it did have some socialist tendencies in it. You know about that because socialism was very popular in Germany. It was anti-Semitic. That's one thing that they talked about. Of course, they didn't like the Jews. They were heavily anti-Treaty of Versailles. Hitler felt like Germany had been stabbed in the back at the end of the war. So they wanted to restore pride in Germany, restore pride in developing their military. They wanted to get back territory that they'd lost after the war. So Hitler kind of wanted revenge for after the war and all that. It was also, like I said, we already talked about that already. It was also very racist, as you know. They didn't like other people that were different from Germans. They saw the Germans as a master race or Aryan race. They were even into the occult a lot, if you know about that, with the Germans, etc. And so those are things that, with the Germans that are kind of famous and all that. Now, of course, as you know, one thing that's, real famous about Hitler, here's some pictures, of course, of Hitler you're kind of looking at. Here's some rare pictures, of course, Hitler. Hard to find a lot of colorized pictures, of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis sometimes. But one thing they're very famous for adopting is the so-called swastika, which Hitler and the Nazis had developed in the 1920s. They think Hitler himself basically designed the swastika, which they think he may have developed around 1920-21. And it's an Eastern symbol, if you know about that, that originated with religions like Hinduism, Buddhism. It's actually a type of symbol that was actually a good luck symbol, seen as a symbol of fortune. However, the Germans, they think, may have incorporated it from, they think, Catholic churches that were in Germany. I think they say Hitler saw it actually in a Catholic church, the image, and decided to use it. And they sometimes call it the Hakenkreuz, was one of the nicknames of it, or the hook cross. And so the Nazis kind of took that and they began to kind of incorporate it with like other symbols that were part of Germany, like the Iron Cross, which went back to medieval times with the Teutonic Knights. It's like a black looking cross. And then the eagle, about that, which was a symbol that went back to the Roman Empire and all of that. So they began to kind of incorporate these kind of symbols as well. Of course, Hitler, if you know about it, will later surround himself with a lot of different leaders. Some of these are kind of men that a lot of people don't like later, kind of seen as some of them being kind of evil, maybe. So you have all these different leaders I'll kind of talk about that were very famous, that were under Adolf Hitler. You may have heard of a guy on the left, which is Hermann Goering, or Goering. He's very famous. He was later the head of the German Luftwaffe, which is what they call the German Air Force, in the 1930s in World War II. Most people don't know, but he was the one that established the German secret police, which is the Gestapo. Probably heard of that, I'm sure. He also built some of the first concentration camps in Nazi Germany, like Dachau, you may have heard of, which was kind of notorious. And then they think, if you know about Goering was originally, he was actually this ex-World War I pilot that had flown with the Red Baron. And he joined the Nazi Party in the early 1920s. So he's kind of an interesting man. And then on the right, you have Heinrich Himmler. Himmler at one point was the head of the Gestapo and what they also call the SS, which was the so-called Schutzstaffel, which means in German, protection squadron. The SS, if you know about it, was this paramilitary force of the Nazis, which dealt with a lot of internal security, like surveillance and things like that. They also enforced a lot of racial policies throughout the country. And they're known for their black uniforms. If you know about their caps, they have the skull and crossbones on their caps. And I think they're on the labels of their shirt or whatever jackets they wear these SS lightning bolt symbols that symbolize the SS and all that. The SS was notorious during the Holocaust, if you know about that, for running a lot of the concentration and death camps. So they were involved in a lot of genocide throughout Europe, which killed millions of people, including a lot of Jews, you can see there, up to maybe 5-6 million at one point. So they do have that. They're kind of notorious, the SS, and a lot of them had to be almost like pure Aryans if you wanted to be in the SS. During World War II, they had the Waffen SS, you know about that, which was a special militarized version of the SS that was separate from the army, the German Wehrmacht, and they were notorious for doing a lot of things, atrocities as well during the war. Other figures that were under Hitler that were kind of notorious was also, you may have heard of Ernest Röhm. He was the head of what they call the SA, which is called the Sturmabteilung, which was the so-called storm detachment, was often called. He joined the Nazis early on, like going back to right after World War I. He was very close with Hitler. I think at one point they were friends. Anyway, they were often called the Brownshirts, because they were known for their brown uniforms. And the SA was kind of instrumental. They were almost like Hitler's bodyguards, protecting Hitler, like at rallies. Like a lot of the Nazis would meet at like beer halls so they protect him. And by the 1930s, the SA had a membership of close to almost like 3 million people that were in it. And they were very powerful. They would go in the streets and beat up anybody who they thought wasn't a pro-Nazi and all that. Also, another figure you may have heard of is Joseph Goebbels. He was big under Adolf Hitler. He was Hitler's main minister of propaganda who controlled a lot of the media, newspapers, radio, things like that. And Goebbels was very famous for using propaganda to control the population, you brainwash people on Nazi ideology. And so because of him, they were able to kind of view people like the Jews and other groups like as vermin. And, when they were trying to kill all the Jews off and things like that, it was easy because everybody believed that they weren't even real human. So they kind of try to turn people into being subhuman and things like that overall. Also, a figure that most people don't really hear about much, but Martin Bormann, he was really big under Hitler later, especially during World War II. He was Hitler's private secretary. I don't know if you know about that. Practically ran the Nazi Party chancellery in Berlin. And so I think up to like the end of the war, he was pretty much the guy that was under Hitler. Although Himmler and Goering were very powerful too. They were up there. It's kind of a debate about who was the number two man, behind Hitler. But those three figures right there, Goering, Himmler, and Bormann, were probably some of the most powerful Nazis that were later under Hitler. Now, of course, the next thing that would happen was that Hitler would then try to come to power, which he tried to do early on in the 1920s. If we talk about the early life of Hitler, one of the big things to really look at is in the 1920s when Hitler would try to seize power. If you know about this, in 1923, Hitler attempted to take power in the Weimar state. The so-called beer hall push, which happened in November of 1923. By the way, the anniversary of that is today. He tried to do this 98 years ago. And if you look at this picture here, he tried to get aid from this general named Erich von Ludendorff, who was kind of in support of the Nazis. Ludendorff was probably the number two general that was under Hindenburg during World War I. And so he backed Hitler in trying to seize power at that point. And so what happened was about 3,000 Nazis tried to basically march on the Munich government in Bavaria. Like that's the capital of Bavaria. But the Munich came out, like their police and all that was able to squash it. Hitler was actually injured, and about 16 Nazis were killed as they tried to seize power at that point. And the reason why they called it the beer hall push was because they believed that the actual attempted coup started in a beer hall, which the Nazis were notorious for having some of their meetings in beer halls. They'd sit around drinking beer. Although Hitler really wasn't a drinker, he wouldn't drink much. He's also a vegetarian. You know about that. And Hofbrauer House, which is still in Munich today. I think the original actual building still there. Where Hitler walks in there. I think he fires a shot in the air with a pistol. Say, hey, we're starting a revolution, that kind of thing. But the thing would fail. Of course, he wouldn't be able to, of course, take power at that point. So what happens is Hitler ends up going to prison. And he ends up serving something like 9 months at one point. And when he's in prison, if you know about it, Hitler decides to write a book, that was called Mein Kampf, which you see here. And I think part of why they wanted him to write a book was because he kept keeping up all the other inmates at night because he was, talking with people and stuff. And so you ought to write a book or something to keep busy so to not disturb everybody. And so, about Mein Kampf itself was this book that was really almost like a political testament and kind of an autobiography about, Hitler's, life before, I guess, his, attempted revolution in the country. And he was actually going to call it 4.5 years of struggle against lies, stupidity, and cowardice. They thought that would be a dumb title, and so he called it Mein Kampf, which actually means my battle or my struggle. And it really outlined the Nazi cause of what the Nazis were going to do when they took power in Germany. He also talked about his early life living in Austria. He hated his father, if you know about that, Alois Hitler, and all that. But Mein Kampf became a bestseller later in Germany. He made a lot of money off of it, and they think the money from it enabled Hitler to rise to power, later as well. And it did talk about a lot of ideas in it that a lot of people really kind of ignored at first, which will kind of come to fruition later that we have. And there's one idea he talks about called Lebensraum, which was this idea that Germany needed living space, to expand. And so he believed that in Eastern Europe, maybe even Russia, that the Germans could conquer that and colonize it. And so he talks about that idea as well. So Lebensraum, or and then another thing that he was really talking about a lot, especially at the beginning of Mein Kampf, which is of course the idea of Anschluss, this idea that Austria ought to be joined with Germany, and so he has that idea as well. He also talks about the Germans as a master race, that they ought to, get rid of Bolshevism, communism, and things like that. Eliminate the Jews. Those are ideas that, of course, Hitler talks about throughout Mein Kampf. And very few people, by the way, read the book outside of Germany. So we most didn't know much about it. I thought Winston Churchill had read it. He got a translation of it or something like that. He was appalled by it and worried about Hitler, what he was going to do. But very few people really, didn't see Hitler as being that bad of a man. And I think at one point, Time magazine had him as Man of the Year. Believe it or not, it was crazy. Now, I guess. But anyway, now what would allow Hitler to seize power? Of course, what we're going to see later. One of the things that'll happen, that they talked about in that short little video, as you know, is that they have a Great Depression happen. Stock market crash, occurs in the United States, October 1929. And so by the early 1930s, the German economy has crashed under the Weimar Republic. You got something like 6 million or more people that are unemployed and all that. And so that's why people started to really listen to the Nazis and listen to Adolf Hitler, throughout the country and all that. About it, Hitler decides he thinks he's popular enough, 1932, to run for the presidency, the president of Germany. And who I told you at the time, Paul Hindenburg, the ex-World War veteran of Germany, was the current president, the second president. At that time, he was the incumbent and all that. And so I think they egged on Hindenburg to run for a second term because they were kind of worried about the Nazis, taking power and all that. And so Hitler ran against him. And part of what allowed Hitler to, spread his ideas and all that was that Hitler used the airplane, like to fly around Germany. And so he was able to get his message to people and things like that. And so that helped to kind of popularize the Nazis throughout the country. And he did pretty good, especially in national elections with the Reichstag and all that. However, he lost, if you know about that. He lost in a very, somewhat close election right here. You can see that Hitler ended up coming in second. Hindenburg got 53% of the vote. And then the Nazis got close to about 37% of the vote. And that's very interesting about that. They're going to, because of that, even though he lost the election and all that, that's going to allow the Nazis to gain a small majority in the Reichstag. And so because of that, you can look at here, you can see why they did it too. The fact that, Germany had all these different political parties, like maybe close to about 8 of them had at one point. About half of them were like socialist or communist. So with the NSDAP having 37% of the vote, Hitler held out, if you know about this, for the chancellorship, is what he did. And so what ended up happening, as you know, because the fact that, Hitler basically, and the Nazis had this majority, it forces Hindenburg, as you know, to make Hitler chancellor, which he does. I think the official date is January 30th. Yeah, January 30th, 1933. That's when Hitler comes in. I think it's kind of like first a coalition government that they put in at first. And a lot of historians seem to think that when Hindenburg does this, they believe that is the beginning of what they call Nazi Germany, which will start 1933 and go to 1945. And later, the Nazis, call it the so-called Third Reich, as you know, which the First Reich was, the Holy Roman Empire. Second Reich was the German Empire under the Kaisers. And then the Third Reich, of course, was the one of the Nazis, which, of course, the Nazis said it would be a 1,000-year Reich, that they would reign afterwards. But you can see it was a little over 12 years, is what it actually, of course, was. One thing about the Nazis, of course, it took them a short time, but within like a year, like between 1933 to 1934, the Nazis consolidate their power, and they eventually take over the whole country. And they basically create this so-called one-party state. That's one thing that they do. It's like kind of what the Soviets did with communism, all that. But they create this Nazi totalitarian state where they basically squash democracy. He uses democracy to take power and then just destroys it, afterwards with that. And there were several incidents that really helped Hitler to really maintain and consolidate his power. One of the big things that happened right after he came in power was the Reichstag fire, which happened on February 27th, 1933. And the Reichstag building, which you see at the top right there, it burned in a fire. Apparently, they believe it was actually set on fire on purpose by this Dutch communist named Marinus van der Lubbe. I think they used to say that the Nazis burned it. They seem to think now that he did do it because they think van der Lubbe was trying to incite some kind of revolution against the Nazis. And so it actually helped the Nazis because basically Hitler turned around and declared that the communists were trying to take over the country, which I don't think they were. But I think van der Lubbe was hoping that basically they would overthrow the Nazis at that point. He was actually beheaded for it. He even confessed to it, actually doing it and all that. And so with that, what happened was the Nazis then turned around. Here's, by the way, a picture of van der Lubbe if you want to look at him right here. But here's the actual building. Actually, the burned Reichstag building, which has actually been restored today. But what happened was the Nazis turned around and they were able to pass through their assembly two actual important documents. One, the Reichstag Fire Decree was one thing, and then the Enabling Act in March of 1933. Both those enabled Hitler and the Nazis to create a totalitarian state in the country. The decree itself, what it did was it allowed the Nazis to arrest political opponents or who they thought were enemies of the state. So that the communists, socialists, and others were kind of rounded up. Some were like put in prison or concentration camps, if you know about that. I think some were even killed by the Nazis later. And then the Enabling Act gave Hitler totalitarian powers, which I think were kind of seen as like emergency type powers. But through that, he was able to eventually create a dictatorship out of it. And so with the threat of communism, like I said, Hitler was able to eventually, take power and all that and consolidate it within like a year or so. So that's basically, how the Nazis were able to take over the country. So overnight, Germany changed because of that. Other thing that happened too that I wanted to talk about was that two things that would happen. Of course, the big thing that would occur, if you know about it, was they'd had this thing called the Night of the Long Knives that would follow that, which happened in June, July of 1934. And Hitler wanted to consolidate further power and also take over the military. And so he eliminated people he thought that were enemies within the Nazi Party. That was especially Ernest Röhm, who really at that time in 1934 probably had the most power because the SA or Brownshirts had like almost 3 million men in it. And so Hitler was kind of concerned that Röhm would overthrow him. And so he overthrew him instead and had him killed. And a bunch of other Nazis who he thought they were kind of a threat to him. And so after that, he basically got the military to take an oath to Hitler. And then the other thing that happened too, you know about it, was that Hindenburg died of natural causes. He was like 80-something years old, dies in August of 1934. And so with Hindenburg out the way, Hitler is able to take the chancellorship and he takes it and merges it with the presidency. It's one office. And this becomes known as the Führer, afterwards. And it was all done through a national plebiscite where the German people voted for Hitler as the Führer. I think in the election, 90% of the people voted yes. I'm not sure what happened to the other 10% that voted no. So after that, it's basically this. Hitler talks about this idea, ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader. So that basically becomes the slogan, of the Nazis, in the Third Reich. And so from there, he will try to make Germany into this major power after he takes over. That's the last thing I want to talk about too with Adolf Hitler, is that after Hitler takes over Germany, he then starts to kind of rearm the country. He tries to seek vengeance against the Western powers in the Treaty of Versailles. And so in Germany, they begin trying to re-enlist people. So like national conscription is brought back where German men have to be in the military again. German Navy, the Army, the Air Force, Luftwaffe, as you know. So that's one thing they begin doing. It begins rearming the country, restarting the whole armaments industry throughout Germany at the time. The other big thing he does too, which is famous, he forms this alliance with other states, which at first, one of the big countries that he aligns with, if you know, is Italy, Kingdom of Italy, with Mussolini. He becomes real close friends with Mussolini because they kind of see themselves as these two fascist states that have common ground. And so it was often called the so-called Rome-Berlin axis. So they called it at first. And then in World War II, it was later called the Axis powers. These are the main allies that fought the Allied powers in the war. And Japan later joined in 1940 with the so-called Tripartite Pact. And so those are the powers that will fight eventually later the Allies, which are France, Britain, Soviet Union, United States, and China, which I'll get to that, of course, later about that. One thing about fascist Italy and Germany, they were kind of instrumental, by the way, in putting in power, if you know about this, Francisco Franco, who was a Spanish general that took over Spain in the Spanish Civil War, which was a big, bloody civil war that broke out in 1936. And if you know about the war, it pitted two different sides right there. You can see there's Francisco Franco, who, by the way, reigned and took over, controlled Spain till like 1975 at one point. And it's an interesting war, Spanish Civil War, because on one side, you had the communists, anarchists that were backed by the Soviets. And on the other side, you had the nationalist side, which had like the Spanish military, like the army, conservatives and monarchists. They were all backed up by fascist dictators like Mussolini and Hitler in Germany. And so they actually used their armed forces, in that war. And so like the German, Italian militaries kind of got, experience before World War II and all that. But it ended up, if you know about it, the Spanish stayed neutral, of course, during during World War II. Was Franco really a fascist? It's kind of been debated about that. Some people call him a semi-fascist. I know he was right-wing and all that, but he was conservative. He was, I think, pro-Catholic, if you know about this. And after his death in 1975, he got Spain to transition back to a democracy. I think they had to call it the so-called Spanish miracle, if you know about that. And they put the Bourbons back in, like King Juan Carlos I, et cetera. And so Spain became a constitutional monarchy, and I think by the 70s, their economy even recovered and stuff like that. So he's kind of this good, bad guy, Franco. But I know he stayed neutral during the war, Franco and Spain, but they did support the Italians and the Germans pretty much in the war, overall. Let me talk about, of course, the other thing that happened that really, leads to, of course, World War II. One thing that happens with Germany, if you know about it, they begin trying to take back territory that they lost back, after World War I ended. And one of the first things that the Germans did, if you know about it, was in 1936. They sought revenge, the Treaty of Versailles, by taking back the Rhineland. So in Western Germany, Hitler in March of that year marched in there and took it back, basically, because it had been a demilitarized zone after the war. And the Allies just kind of just watched, like France and Britain probably could have stopped them, but they didn't. And so they just marched right in there. I think 36 was when they could have stopped Hitler, but they didn't, about that. So that was the first thing. Then in March of 1938, the Germans then march into Austria, and they take over that too, and actually annex it into the Third Reich, which the Germans later call it Anschluss, which means in German, joining. And so that became the so-called Greater German Reich, or Greater Germany. So people kind of looked away too, like, oh, they're all Germans anyway. Let's not have it, It's all German, same German garden, all that. So people kind of ignore that as well and don't do anything about it either. Also, the League of Nations, which was around, before the war, didn't really do anything much about it. They were kind of weak. I think they tried to put embargoes on countries and things like that. But a lot of countries like Britain, France, they favored what they call appeasement. Like the policy of appeasement becomes real popular before World War II. Try to stop these fascist dictators. And appeasement was a popular policy in the 1930s. They really believed that they could make political, material, or even territorial concessions, to people to try to prevent war and things like that. And it backfired. It didn't really work. And so it actually made these dictators more powerful. And eventually, when they overran Europe and started World War II, it was too late to do anything about it. Then the other thing that was, of course, the last one, which was kind of a big one too, was the issue over Western Czechoslovakia, an area called Sudetenland, which was an area that had maybe close to about 3 Germans maybe living there in that area, which had been given to Czechoslovakia after World War I had ended. And Hitler wanted that annexed too. He wanted to include that in Germany and threatened to invade in October 1938 if they didn't give it to him. So this became known as the so-called Sudeten crisis, Sudetenland crisis, they dub it. It almost causes World War II to break out in 1938. And so countries like Britain, France realize that they don't do anything about it diplomatically. They might be looking at another war, like in World War I. And so Britain, France, Germany, Italy decided to have a diplomatic conference to avoid any kind of conflict that might create, World War II at that point. And so in what is Munich, Germany, Neville Chamberlain, who, by the way, was the prime minister of Great Britain, flew there to meet with him. And it was called different names. They call it the so-called Munich Pact or Munich Agreement. I think the Czechs called it the Munich Betrayal, things like that. The French leader that was there was Edward Dallier. And then, of course, you see there Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, was there. Mussolini of Italy was there. And then Hitler was there, of course, for the German side as well. And what the French and the British decided to do was they decided to give Hitler that land, the Sudetenland, in exchange for peace, because they didn't really want to fight war. And so they decided to settle with appeasement to basically prevent war from happening. And Chamberlain, who, by the way, was very naive, he thought Hitler was a type of politician he could trust, things like that. There was even a case where Hitler signed a piece of paper, they call it a scrap of paper, I think is what they called it, which guaranteed peace in Europe and all that. And so Chamberlain flew back to England and told everybody that I believe it is peace for our time. And this particular quote, by the way, it proved to be very erroneous. If you know about it, it's a very bitter ironic too, with the value with that quote of what he said, because, I guess within a year, they would have, World War II break out and all that. And so, what's going to happen eventually is that, it's really funny about it. They basically gave Hitler's the Sudetenland. Well, guess what? He's going to take the rest of Czechoslovakia. After giving that to Hitler, he takes over the eastern part of Czechoslovakia by the spring of 1939. And then within a few months later, he invades also Poland in September of that year. And so you've got basically World War II, breaking out. So they could have stood up to Hitler. They could have said, if you take basically Sudetenland, that means war, and maybe he would have backed down. But Hitler really thought that the Western powers were weak. He also thought that if he took Poland, they wouldn't do anything about it because they didn't do anything about him to stop the other land that he took as well. So we're now on a war footing here, 1938, of course, to 1939 at that point. Now, later in the week, I will kind of be moving on, of course, to talk about, the outbreak of World War II. I'll kind of talk about the beginning of the war from 1939 to 1941. We did have a few other students, I think, that joined us earlier. It's like Shane, Mark, Sophie, Courtney, and Amber, I think, had joined us earlier also on YouTube. So hope you're having a good morning out there. And I think Michaela had also joined us in StreamYard. Just wanted to recognize y'all that are out there today. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about World War II this week, of course, and next week. Of course, one of the bloodiest conflicts, of course, in human history. I think close to 50, 60 million people die at one point in those conflicts, of course, which is pretty much worldwide. So doesn't look like I have any questions like today. But if you do have a comment, question, of course, about this lecture, please let me know, of course, later. If you want to subscribe to my channel, you can also do that as well. But a reminder, I did put up a new Canvas quiz, of course, on World War I. I'll try to get announcements, of course, about that out there as later. But don't forget the video quiz bonus assignment. I think that was on Devil's Island, a documentary. That's going to expire, of course, tonight. So I'll see y'all later in the week. Y'all take care and hope y'all have a great pretty much week overall. So y'all take care, okay? So y'all take care.